I want to thank you for being here today and agreeing to do this.
Thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Your accomplishments in your Wikipedia page speak for themselves. So why are you so passionate about social work, activism, and bringing social change to the most vulnerable of society?
Well, you and I know each other because of our work in trying to help fathers whose rights or whose involvement with their children is being inhibited by government agencies and things that just happened in the family. And I'm asked that question a lot, actually, and I don't usually answer it honestly, but because it involves my relationship with my father, I wanted to answer it here honestly. My father died when I was 10, and he worked basically all the time. So I was 6th of 8 children, and while he had a relationship with some of my older siblings, because he worked all the time, after work he would go get drunk at the local bar. I never had really a relationship with him, except a negative one. I would pick on my sisters and he would hit me with the belt, you know. I would have fantasies when I was younger, of my father holding me in a cell. I felt so oppressed by the way he was treating me, and I've repressed a whole lot of that. I think it informs, however, decisions I've made about what I wanted to do with my life. I felt like not only was I repressed, but I was oppressed. And even though it's one person with their father and nothing like the kind of abuse that goes on in a lot of families, I felt like my instinct was to fight back. And my instinct was, as I got older, to fight back on behalf of other people who were suffering the kind of not, I don't want to use the term oppression, it sounds too political, but who were suffering from what was happening to them in their families and in society. And early on, I learned about politics. I was 8 years old when John Kennedy ran for president, and my parents were Catholic, and the whole Catholic community was organizing around supporting Kennedy for president. I remember being sent out to give stickers that people could put on their windows asking for votes for Kennedy when I was 8 years old. And when he got elected, it felt, in the Catholic community, it felt like such an enormous step forward for credibility and for respect that I felt that too. As a Catholic boy, I was going to a Catholic school. I was, had nuns as teachers. My uncle was a prominent Catholic priest in Philadelphia. So early on, I think I had the political bug. And as I got older, I realized also that I had been taught in the Catholic schools I went to think, to actually think things through before you reacted. Now, plenty of people know me and know that there's plenty of times I don't think before I react. But as a profession, I have learned that I'm actually pretty good at figuring out what are the steps to get from this bad place that we are to get to a better place. Rarely are we getting to a good place, but we're getting to a better place. And over the years, that has taught me that I have an instinct for how to organize, how to sometimes even to motivate people and to get people passionate about getting something better for themselves in their lives. That it just comes naturally to me out of the early experiences I had. My family was never about going into business or making money or all that kind of stuff. That was just not an ethic that we had. Not that we were low income, but my parents never forced us in any particular direction. So my brothers and sisters and I all took different paths. Some in social services, like I have done. I'm the only one who's as political as I am, and I'm sort of mumbling your question, I think.
No, you're not. You're nailing it.
I guess what I want to say is that I had early experiences in my most I'm blanking out on the word. My worst sensitive, my weakest years, in my young years, I had early experiences of feeling I was being treated unfairly. And I learned something from that experience. And also the fact, it's corny, but the fact that my name is Fair, that meant something to me when I was younger. And I figured I have to be fair to people, and I have to make sure that the world I live in, at least, people are being treated fairly. And I've been doing that since I was a student activist, getting the nuns to slap me on the wrist for my behavior in grade school to today. Unfortunately for me, I'm a white man who has some education. I went to Penn. I graduated from Penn. So I've been able to get paid to do this kind of work. It's blended into doing social work because I believe social work is fundamentally about advocating for people who need help, who don't have the power themselves to be able to get the help that they need. And that's a political process as far as I'm concerned.
So were you Catholic trained schooling?
Yes.
From grade school right through high school?
Right through high school, yes.
What high school did you go to, just out of
I
curiosity?
went to West Philadelphia Catholic Boys High School.
I went to St. Joe's Prep. We were rivals back then. Of
Okay,
course.
I was going to say, we'll forgive you.
Right, thank you. So I want to start with the early life, as you described basically your career in three parts. But let's talk about that early life through the 70s. You started as an activist in college. In the Wikipedia article, but really you seem like you started beforehand. So tell us about those early years.
Well, when I was in high school was at the height of the Vietnam War. And early on in fact, I was interviewed when I was a freshman in high school. I don't know how this happened. I honestly don't know how the connection was made. But I was interviewed by KYW. And they were asking questions about what I thought about the world. And one of them was, what did I think about the Vietnam War? This was probably 1966. And I remember saying, my brother has a little clip for this from 70 years ago. I remember saying, well, they asked us to be there, so we should probably be fighting for the independence of Vietnam or something like that. It didn't take me long after that I was starting to read progressive publications. I was a 14-year-old boy, but I read the New York Times from cover to cover every day. And so I started to learn that maybe the Vietnam War was not the best thing that had happened to America. And so I did get involved in anti-war activism when I was in high school, just to show up at rallies and show up at demonstrations and things of that nature.
David, were you encouraged to read the New York Times when you were that young, or was that a natural thirst for news and knowledge?
I think it was more natural thirst because we were all smart kids. I mean, all of my seven siblings, we all did well in school, but I was the only one who really was paying attention to public affairs and what was going on in the world in the way that I was. And they can all explain their paths, and they would be totally different than the way I'm just explaining mine. But there was something about politics that attracted me. I remember getting into arguments with a friend of mine who was a person who was similarly addicted to the news.
What age?
When I was a sophomore. When I was I was a sophomore in high school. The anti-war movement was at its height, and the 1968 presidential campaign was happening. And he was enamored of Eugene McCarthy because McCarthy stood against the war and against President Johnson. I was a Kennedy fan from my days putting posters up for Jack Kennedy, and so we would argue about who was the better candidate for president. As a result of that, I met people. I met some people that later on in my life I would bump into, who were politically active and who were involved in the political system primarily, who would drag me into other campaigns and other kinds of activism. I can't really call myself an activist in high school, but I was thinking like an activist. And when I got to college, this was 1970, the universities and colleges were in an uproar about the war and about feminism and about all sorts of issues. And I fell into that community very easily and have stayed in it, really, for my whole life. Do things differently when you're a 71-year-old than you do when you're 18. But I was very active in the anti-war movement because I was a Philadelphian living on the Penn campus. My home was about 20 blocks from Penn, but they gave me a scholarship that allowed me to live on campus. So that was like freeing me from any family restrictions I might have been feeling. And
but you did something at Penn too. You actually
I was
starting
to talk about that.
Good.
I mean, I think, right at the time I was coming to Penn was when the federal legislation giving 18-year-olds the right to vote was implemented. I mean, literally, I went to Penn as somebody who couldn't vote, and 2 months later, I was allowed to vote because the new law had been instituted, and because of the war, it was important to everybody who supported the war that we do something to get Nixon out of the White House. But also, when I went to a carnival that my old grade school would have every year, or my old parish, Most Blessed Sacrament, they would have a carnival every year. And I went to the carnival after I had gone to Penn. For some reason I went to the carnival, and Frank Rizzo came to the carnival. He was a police captain and was very well known, especially in the Italian-American community, and my mother was Italian, so we had some connection. And he gave this incredibly racist speech about keeping the darkies out of our neighborhood.
You could get away with that back then, I suppose.
Yes, you could.
Could you imagine saying that now?
And wow. I was in the audience for that speech. So I remember having vicious arguments with my mother, who wasn't really a Rizzo supporter, but he was Italian and she was Italian, and we were both Catholic. She had a sensitivity, I guess, to him. But I would get vicious arguments with my mother. My father had died 10 years earlier, about Frank Rizzo and what he meant. And to me, what he meant was a local version of Nixon. And really, in my emotional reaction to things in those younger days, he was really like the Philadelphia version of Hitler. And I still, I had met maybe...
Nixon had that reputation?
Well, Nixon had a very negative reputation among young people.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because
Rizzo was a Philly version.
Rizzo was a Philadelphia version, sure. Exactly. So anyway, all of that's to say that when the 18-year-old vote came down, I was on the Penn campus. I had met some of the politically active people in the neighborhood around the university, most of whom were connected to the university in some way. And it occurred to me that there were thousands of 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds on the Penn campus who were not able to vote because you could only vote from your home address. And most of the people on the Penn campus were from out of town. So I talked to a friend of mine who I had met in the So the political work that I was doing, his name is Mark Bernstein. He later became a common pleas court judge. And I said, there's got to be some way that we can organize the students at the University of Pennsylvania to fight Rizzo. It was really about fighting Rizzo at that point, because Rizzo was running for mayor the next year. And he said, well, the law says you can't vote from your campus address, you have to vote from your home address, which I was able to do because my home address was 20 blocks away. But most of the students that I was getting to know couldn't do that. And I said, together we basically came to the conclusion we should challenge that law. Where does that law come from? And we did. And because my name was Fair, and they could call it the Fair Voting Rights case, I got to be the named plaintiff. And we sued the city and ultimately the state to change the rules so that people could vote from their campus addresses, and we won.
Who is this partner that you said you had this joint idea with?
Mark
Judge Bernstein.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the two of you hatched this. This was no Rizzo opponent. The two of you you two hatched this on your own together.
Yes. And I didn't have to do the work. He was a law student, so he took care of all the work. I just got to be the face of the case, and we won. And overnight, we were able to organize, not just me, obviously, and not just Mark, but a bunch of people were able to organize a new voting division on the Penn campus that went from maybe about 15 people who were Philadelphia residents to 1,800 voters, all students, all pretty much left-wing students who we could use to organize against Frank Rizzo. And late 1970, most of 1971 was about keeping Rizzo from becoming mayor of Philadelphia. I worked with a guy by the name of David Cohen, who was a city councilman in Philadelphia for a very long time. He ran against Rizzo. He eventually pulled out because he was not going to win, and he supported Bill Green, who everybody thought was the great liberal white hope, but he couldn't beat Rizzo either. So Rizzo wound up getting elected, and
Bill Green became mayor later.
He became mayor later. He actually ultimately succeeded Rizzo,
right. But
that was 8 years later. We had 8 whole years of Rizzo, and that's a whole nother interview.
Yes.
But I had definitely gotten the political bug at that time, and so I got involved in the presidential campaign, which was the year later. The most anti-war candidate was George McGovern. People who I had known, or had met rather, back when I was in high school in the anti-war movement were now organizing for George McGovern. So I got in with them and started the chapter on our campus. This is when I was a sophomore, Penn People for George McGovern. And we organized to elect delegates. I think it was the first or second time, probably the first time, that the party was electing delegates as opposed to being appointed by the political machine. And we did very well in terms of electing McGovern delegates. I actually got to go down to the Democratic Convention that year. I wasn't a delegate or anything, but I slept on somebody's hotel room floor and got into the convention for about an hour. So that's always one of the. It always feels like I was there when history was being made, when McGovern got nominated, though he got creamed later.
So I want to make this point. You're not talking about anyone you're learning from or following or any playbook that you're, what would I say, mirroring. You're actually doing all this on your own as some like a first mover.
Well, I'm sure there were people who were, I'm sure there were people, but and there were definitely people like David Cohen, for example, like Mark, who I was learning that you can be committed to doing things that make the world more just, and it's okay to be that kind of person. But I mean, I don't know I'm sure I was influenced by 1,000 different influences.
What I mean is, you're not following an individual.
But I wasn't.
You're doing this on your own.
I was on my own, and I wasn't a particular. I mean, I turned out to be a B student when I graduated, but I never paid attention to being a Penn student. You know, I was sleepwalking through my education.
But you were certainly busy doing other things.
But my life was about the work that I was doing. I had a job. I was working as a messenger for the Philadelphia Bulletin, which is interesting because I had to pick up advertising for the paper. My job was to go out and pick up the advertising because there weren't the electronic things we can do today. And
you mean physically
pick it up.
Right.
And that meant I got to travel all over the city, and I got to meet all sorts of people. For the first time in my life, I met a black person who I spoke to, a fellow messenger for the Bulletin. We still actually stay in touch once in a while on LinkedIn 50 years later.
It's another point I want to make. You being so offended by Rizzo wasn't because you were standing up for a black friend. You actually had this sense of fairness, that it struck your conscience as morally wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, there are times when I have been involved in movements that predominantly impact the African American community, but and there's always an issue, a quandary about the role to play if you're a white man in a movement that's not really your movement. But in those days, Rizzo represented hate, not just of black people. He hated women. He hated gay people. I was deeply in the closet at the time. I was very unaware of the fact that ultimately I was a gay man. I just ignored that, and I wasn't very social, so I didn't have girlfriends. And when I was in high school and stuff like that, I was thinking on the way over here that when I was a sophomore, all of the students at West Catholic were supposed to take gym. And somehow or other, I was not assigned to gym, I was assigned to typing. So I learned how to type. I eventually was proud of the fact I could type so fast. And I've always wondered, how did I end up in typing rather than gym? And thinking back, I'm thinking my mother, perhaps, or maybe the people at the school realized that if I was in the gym, that might be a struggle for me, because they could see something in me that I wasn't admitting to at all. I wasn't even thinking about that I was gay. It really wasn't. And I got married, actually, when I was a sophomore in high school.
College or high school?
College, rather. I'm sorry.
I followed you. Keep going.
I got married when I was a sophomore in college to a woman that I met working in she was in the McGovern. She also was a volunteer in the McGovern campaign, and we had both been asked to be on a TV show to talk about our support for McGovern, and that's how I met her. And as far as I was concerned, this was the perfect relationship and remained that way. Even after I turned gay, realized I was gay.
You're still friends?
Oh yeah, we're still very, very close friends. Weirdly enough, I called her up one night after I had cheated on her. She worked overnight at Einstein Medical Center as a technician, and I called her up in the middle of the night to tell her that I had cheated on her, and it was a great experience. And up until that time, the couple of times I had cheated on her with a man, I would come back to her and say, well, I did this, but it's terrible, it's disgusting. This is not for me. And this was the first time I had a positive sexual experience with a man. And obviously that was the beginning of the end for that marriage, but it wasn't in any way an end to the relationship. We've had a very strong relationship since then.
So,
I got off track. I apologize.
No, you actually are leading into the next topic that I was going to bring up anyway. So when you said deeply closeted, and it's funny, we're in 2023 at the time this is being recorded, and you have, it's a certainly different time. Is part of the whole experience that we read about as being deeply closeted, is that more because you don't consider the thought because of society's pressures, whereas now that's being more removed so children are more aware younger? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, that is definitely true. In the society we're living in, you mean more aware of being gay?
Yes.
Yes. No, I mean, the way that homosexuality has been normalized, I mean, for plenty of people, that's a terrible thing. But for people like me, it's a good thing that society has normalized the fact of homosexuality. And so the deep, deep, deep self-destructive closet that I lived in until I was 24, which I'm sure has had all sorts of influence on bad choices I have made over the years because of that fear and because of that sense of being outcast and sick and all that went along with being a closeted gay person. That's not the experience of most young people today. I mean, they might have that experience in their particular family, their particular community, but there's a world out there that's saying you don't have to feel that way about yourself. The world, when I was growing up, was saying you should feel that way about yourself because that's who you are.
So I suppose what I'm speaking to are these re-education, conservative, alt-right Christian camps that try to teach something out of you. This is not a confusion issue. This is an issue that you have self-deprecating thoughts because of what society thinks, not because your own personal confusion.
Exactly right.
That's the point that I think that needs to be made.
And I think that there's still enough homophobia in the world, and there's still enough gay people who fear being known as gay or lesbian or transgendered or whatever because it's a risky thing to do in some communities. Philadelphia generally is not one of those risky communities. It's a pretty positive community to grow up in as a gay person. But there's still reason to be concerned if you know that you realize you're gay, that your choices are not going to be as easy or respected in the same way as somebody who wasn't gay. And younger people, younger and younger, are learning that lesson very early because the community, the media makes it reasonably safe to know what it means to be gay. And so if you're connecting to that when you're 8 years old, or 10 years old, or 12 years old, your options are much greater than they would have been for me at that age. But it's still tough because you're still saying, I am somebody who is different, and I want to be respected with that difference. I've never wanted to be. I've been a gay activist for literally 50 years, but I've never wanted to be known as a gay activist. You know, it was one of the things that was going on in my life. I'd rather be known as a community organizer for communities who are in some way discriminated against or oppressed, and that can be anybody. It can be women who want to be priests. I worked at an Episcopal church where the first woman Episcopal priest preached at the church while I was there. It can be from that all the way to black kids who are abandoned by their families and who go through a child welfare system that's not supporting them. You know, so it's.
Well, let me clarify. What you're saying is you don't just want to be known as a gay rights activist. Because you're an activist for all protected classes, is what you...
Well,
nothing against being an activist you mean, for gays.
No, I understand.
I'm clarifying
yes.
Because... That's,
yeah, and a lot of people, I think there's a lot of people who don't know I'm gay. Not because I hide it, it's just because it's never come up. I work in an organization that has 500 employees, and the vast majority of them don't have the faintest idea that I'm gay because there's been no reason for it to come up. They do know about other things that I've gotten attention for that I've been involved in, but that's not one of them.
So was that a gradual thing that was building up, or was it sudden light bulb moment because of the positive experience that you had?
It was, I have to say that intellectually, I did not feel like I was gay. Even after I had some experiences that made me realize I'm enjoying this with men. I think, because you always had the out of being a bisexual. One of the first gay thing I ever did in the political sense was I was walking on South Street and passed a sign that said Gay Community Center. And I went in just to see what it was like. And there was this big wall that had all these posters and leaflets and things nailed to the wall, stuck on the wall, of all these things that were going on in this gay community that I didn't even know existed until I saw this wall. And one of the things going on was a weekly men's group called Gay and Bisexual Married Men. And I was enough of a spiritual person to think that I was meant to walk into that room at that particular time. And I went to that group, and I actually stayed in that group for almost 8 years. We met on a weekly basis. And we all had different kinds of choices we were making. A number of the people truly did think of themselves as bisexual. I was one of the ones who eventually said, well, I wouldn't resist it if a woman wanted to have sex with me. So I'm capable, but I really want to be gay. I mean, I really think that's who I am. That's my core. And they taught me how to handle my relationship with Sonia, my wife, so that I wasn't hurting her, and giving her agency really to be able to make decisions for us. That, I wanted to stay with her. I had a happy life with her. We were both compatible in 1,000 ways, but she obviously wanted a different kind of life for herself. And this men's group, allowed me to give her that space. So eventually we got separated and divorced.
And for time, while you're thinking, the time that you officially came out was 1976. When did you walk into that?
1976.
Oh, so it was the same year.
It was the summer of 1976.
Happened somewhat quickly then, not gradual.
And as a result of being at the Gay Community Center, I got to know actual gay activists. I had been an activist. I had a little bit of a reputation in the city just as a community organizer. So that got me deeply into gay activism for about 3 or 4 years. I helped to start a group called the Philadelphia Lesbian and Gay Task Force, which was a civil rights organization arguing for legal rights for gay and lesbian and transgender people. I created something called the Gay Cultural Festival, which we had for 2 years on the Penn campus, where we brought in comedians and actors and movies and all sorts of things about the gay experience on the Penn campus, where it was relatively safe. So we did have a couple of incidents while we were having the festival. I got deeply into all of that. And what also was happening around that time in the gay movement was that lesbian women were saying, this is not a gay male movement. Women are involved in this movement as well and should be treated with respect. So we changed the name of the Philadelphia Gay Task Force to the Philadelphia Lesbian and Gay Task Force. And we got into, I was working as an administrative assistant at an Episcopal church, but my spirit was involved in gay activism. In 1980, one of the friends I had met on the Penn campus, his name is Scott, and I helped to organize electing openly gay and lesbian committee people. Committee people are the local political representatives in Philadelphia, it's always the Democratic Party. And when there was a large concentration of gay white men in Center City, Philadelphia, and so we organized the gay community in Center City, Philadelphia to elect representatives into the Democratic City Committee committee people.
I dropped the ball not picking up, not pointing out something, but you said an incident. Penn's campus was safe and there was an incident. You're referring to a hate crime against peaceful gatherings,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I wanted to be specific about that. I understood, but for younger people watching, need to know what you went through and what it was like to have to gather because it was an unsafe time. Sorry for interrupting. I hope I didn't get you off your
No, no. We organized the election of these committee people, and it drew the attention of the newspapers, which at that time were the Bulletin and the Inquirer, and they both wrote articles about Scott and I and the fact that we were being politically active, not as culture advocates, but as Democrats. And we were organizing the Democratic Party to be supportive of lesbian and gay people. And there was an article in the paper about that. And the year before that, both Scott and I had supported a guy named Lucian Blackwell, who was a city council person who ran for mayor against Bill Green, who ultimately got elected. And we had formed a group called Gay and Lesbian Friends of Lucian Blackwell. So as a result, we both got to meet all sorts of politically active lesbian and gay people throughout the city. And we organized them, as I said, in 1980 to elect committee people that got attention of the newspapers. Henry Nicholas, who was a major political power broker in the black community, realized or noticed the work that we were doing. And he went to Scott and say, he was the president of the Hospital Workers Union, which was very politically active. And he asked Scott if he wanted to work at the union. And Scott said no, but David probably would. And so Nicholas called me up, offered me a job as his administrative assistant. And suddenly I found myself connected on a daily basis to one of the most powerful black political leaders in the city, who began, because it was just the work of the union, introducing me to lots of other black political leaders in the city. That's how I met Bill Gray. That's how I met Shaka Fatah. That's how I met Dwight Evans. That's how I met all these, Vince Hughes. These are all people who were prominent over the later years, and some of them still prominent today. But I met them as a member of the Hospital Workers Union, which was overwhelmingly African American union with a large gay constituency. And because healthcare has always attracted, for some reason, a lot of people from my community. And so I got to have more influence by association just because I was from the union. I was openly gay. I was not quiet about being gay. I was still active in gay activities, gay political activities. And the union tolerated that. Nicholas supported me. I worked several times when people in the gay community who I was having difficulty with would go to complain to Nicholas and say, David Fair is using the union's letterhead to fight this battle. And he always backed me up 1,000%. I learned an enormous amount. I guess if there was a mentor, now that you asked me earlier about mentors, there are two. But one of them was Henry Nicholas. He was an amazing strategist.
And his position was?
He was president of the union. He was president of the local union. He later became president of the national union.
You're going to give me the second person, but while I ask you that, you have labor and AIDS activism, but your work with labor really was closely tied to the gay experience or gay rights, correct?
Well,
or am I not right? I don't mean to lead.
They were happening at the same time.
At the same time.
I mean, I was basically using my union, the credibility I had from being associated with the most powerful political union in the city. At least in the black community, it was the most powerful union. I had credibility from that because it really just never occurred to me not to be myself in the union. It was a very accepting kind of place. We eventually would have events there, drag shows, all sorts of things in the union hall. It became a real place for the gay community.
So was it majority gay?
No.
Strong minority.
I would say maybe 15-20%.
Okay.
But they were black and gay, which is different constituency than the white gay movement that I had been involved with for all those years. And I
Because
learned
of the double protected class?
yeah, for a lawyer, that's the right term, I guess. Anyway, the Wilson Good decided to run for mayor. Henry Nicholas, who was my boss, had been encouraging him to do that. And I had known Wilson because he was managing director of the city and active in black political circles where...
I want to apologize if I got you off. Was this the second person who influenced you?
No.
Let's start there,
Well,
because
yes.
I interrupted you.
Now the list is getting longer. Yes, I would say Wilson's another one who has mentored me. He has taught me how to be clear about my objective, how to articulate my objective, and how to recognize that sometimes being emotional about achieving your objective hurts your ability to achieve your objective. Wilson Good is a preacher. He can get very into emotional inspiration.
A preacher meaning a minister?
He's a minister
I
as
wasn't
well.
aware.
Yeah. We had a mutual friend of ours died last year around this time, and Wilson spoke at his funeral, and it was like a classic Baptist church in motion.
Two-way interaction between the preacher and the community that's shouting back, and
Right,
kind
yeah.
of like a dance almost, if you will.
But despite the fact that he has that part of him, in his political world, he was calm all the time, and he was focused on getting what he wanted to get done. And I think history will show that even though the city was in bad economic shape at that time when he was mayor, and MOVE happened, and that always has been on his back, he got an enormous amount done for regular people simply because he was focused, and he taught me that. And later on, I don't know, I'm jumping around, but 5 years after he became mayor, I had harassed him so much about the city's lack of response to AIDS that he came to me and said, "What can I do to satisfy you?" And I said, "You should appoint me to create an AIDS office," which he did.
Wonderful.
Which was extremely controversial at the time, even in the gay community, because the Gay News, which was a publication that had started a few years earlier, didn't like me very much, because by that time I was associated with challenging the white gay community to be less racist. There's nothing more racist than who you pick for your sexual partners. And one day I woke up and realized the only black people in the gay movement are black people who have white lovers. Where are the black people who have black lovers? And they weren't part of that movement. There was a whole separate subpopulation that nobody was paying attention to. But early on in the 1980s, I learned, because I was at the healthcare union after all, that AIDS was most of the people with AIDS were part of that black gay community. There were plenty in the white gay community, and I knew them, and I was very active in the AIDS movement in the white gay community. But early on I realized that there was this whole other community that wasn't being educated about AIDS, wasn't being supported in the same way the white gay men were being supported. And because I was immersed in this black organization, as it turned out, my sexual preferences were more directed towards people of color for whatever reason. And so I got to know that community in a different way than most white gay people, and committed myself as an AIDS activist that I was going to make sure that people understood that this was not a white gay disease, it was a gay disease early in the epidemic, and that all gay people, including people who weren't white, were being impacted by it.
Just to keep our organization of your story straight, you were about to talk about meeting Wilson, but before that, you had one other person to share who was an influence.
Well, this was actually associated.
Nichols, Wilson, but there's a third.
And the third one
Mayor Good, excuse me.
Mayor
and
Good. The third one was a woman by the name of Estelle Richmond, who still plays a very active role as my mentor in my life. as does Wilson. She came into city government when I became the director of the AIDS office. She came into, I was there to shake up city government so it would have a response to this crisis of AIDS. At that time, we only had 700 people who had had AIDS in Philadelphia, but the projections were thousands and thousands of people getting AIDS. And so there was this atmosphere of crisis. The other thing that was going on in the social services end of city government was that we had a mental health office that was very old-fashioned and not being very effective. So Wilson brought in Estelle from Cleveland to kick ass in the mental health office. He hired me to kick ass in the health department, and he hired another woman by the name of Jane Malone, who was brought in to kick ass when it came to homeless people, which was a major priority of Wilson's. There had not even been an office in city government that was effectively helping homeless people before Wilson came up with that idea. And the three of us were real change agents. And when I came in to the health department, I was very angry. I was an organizer, so I thought I would know how to organize the government so it was more responsive. But I tended to be too aggressive. And the typical there's two kinds of bureaucrats. They're the ones who are just waiting for somebody to challenge them to do something. And then there's the vast majority of them that want you to pass them by. They're waiting for their retirement. And in the health department, they were mostly the second people. And I would be frustrated with them, and I would get angry at them. And I would go to the newspapers and complain about what was going on that was preventing the good administration from responding to the AIDS epidemic just because of bureaucratic stuff. In fact, the Philadelphia Inquirer they used to have a magazine called the Inquirer magazine, and they put me on the cover of the magazine one Sunday, and I'm sitting there like this, staring directly out of the cover, and underneath it says the guerrilla bureaucrat, like the guerrilla, the revolutionary guerrilla, Guerilla.
At that point, what was your position?
I was director of the AIDS office at the time. And it was basically telling the story of that article, telling the story of my fight with the health department bureaucracy to get them to notice AIDS and to respond to AIDS and do something about AIDS. This relates to Estelle because in her way, she was reforming the Office of Mental Health, but she wasn't attracting anything like the attention I was attracting in the media or even within city government. She was an expert in how to provide these services and was plodding through to reform that system from inside. And she taught me, over the years, how to make the bureaucracy work without blowing people up. And I still haven't learned that as much as I should, but that's what makes her another mentor for me, because I've learned there are building blocks to change, and you can identify what they are and do them one by one. You don't have to win on the first day.
David, just to get a timeline of where we are in your life, about what year are we at this point?
When I talk about the AIDS work, that's the late 80s, and that was a pivotal point in my life. But what I didn't mention, because it was more associated with my work at the union, was that when Wilson Goode became mayor, he created an office to help people who are homeless. And up until that point, the perception in the public of homeless people was that they were drug addicts and drunks, and they lived on Skid Row, and people were used to them being there. It was just something that came with living in America. What started to happen in the mid-1980s with Reaganomics was that a lot of people who were otherwise accomplished people who could support their families became homeless. And these were not your typical drug addict or your typical drunk. These were
mentally ill.
Mentally, don't forget the mentally ill as well. But the population of homeless people was changing to where there were more people who were economically homeless. They were homeless because they couldn't find a job because of Reaganomics, or they lost a good job because of Reaganomics. And Wilson wanted to do something about that. So, and he tells a story about sitting in his office and looking out the window and seeing all the homeless people in Love Park that didn't have any place to go. And he found a place for them that night because he had Jane Malone working with him, the woman he brought in to work on homeless stuff. The homeless population there was a political movement among the homeless population. It was run, and the lead activist was a guy by the name of Chris Sproul. And Chris came, I didn't know him at the time, but he came to me and asked if he could use the Union Hall to have a meeting. So that's how I got to meet him. And he drew me into what eventually became the Philadelphia Delaware Valley Union of the Homeless. We decided that we're a union. Unions can organize around almost anything. They don't just have to be healthcare or your work. That we would organize homeless people to have a political constituency that the politicians would need to pay attention to. And eventually we actually got, we did other cities as well, all together in New York and in Washington and in Baltimore, some places out on the West Coast, which I never got to go to. This idea of a union of the homeless, which is on Wikipedia as well, attracted almost 15,000 people who signed up and paid $1 a month to be members of the of the Union of the Homeless. And I was deeply involved in that because most of the people who were involved in the homeless union didn't have college educations. They didn't have the access I had to the media, because one of my roles at the union was to be the media spokesman for the Hospital Workers Union.
Another obvious thing they don't have, a mailing address or a phone number to be able to reach them.
Absolutely.
How did you get around that?
Well, we became that. Eventually, Chris had his own organization called the Committee for Dignity and Fairness to the Homeless, and Wilson respected Chris a lot and gave him a grant to have an emergency shelter at a church at 20th and Spring Garden that was called Dignity Shelter. And so that became a base of operations for homeless people. I was the person who was looking for ways to get public attention for the homeless issue. So we had a sit-in on SEPTA buses because we needed to, homeless people didn't have the money to get a public transportation, and we wanted to have some mechanism by which people could get on the bus and go to their jobs if they had a job. It was a weird thing. The Philadelphia General Hospital had closed a few years before that, and the University of Pennsylvania, which was next door to PGH, had made a commitment that it would provide free health care, hospital care, for 50 homeless people a year. But they were treating that as poor people, and they had lots of poor people coming into the hospital, so they never actually set aside 50 beds, which was the concept. They just said, we do a lot of charity care, so that covers that. Our argument was, the agreement was to have 50 beds. You need a unit of 50 beds that we can come in and see and touch, because there's plenty of homeless people who could use your help. We had a sit-in the health commissioner's office. Interestingly enough, an office that I eventually worked out of years later doing my AIDS work. I got very involved in homeless activism through the Union of the Homeless locally, and then later the National Union of the Homeless. I was part of a very progressive political organization within the union movement that got me to meet other activists and organizers around the country. Unions are all about organizing. You're organizing people to empower themselves, and I think that's where I learned most of my skills about organizing.
How did the free transportation work? How did you verify that people were homeless or receptive?
Well, we never succeeded in that particular agenda.
Okay, but
the point wasn't so much to win; it was to educate. We had all sorts of demonstrations. There was an employment agency that would hire homeless people to go work in the farms and fields in South Jersey every day, and they would come back and they would be told that they were going to get paid $17 a day, and in fact they would get paid $5 a day because the employment agency took the other 12. So we had a sit-in that office. In fact, one of those sit-ins happened on the day that the MOVE fire happened, and that particular day I got arrested at this demonstration at the employment agency, and they brought me in. They bring it for when you're having a demonstration or something like that. It's not that they're going to actually charge you with a serious crime, but they do want it to end. So they arrest you and pull you out and bring you down to the roundhouse and process you, and then they let you go usually.
Without being charged.
Without being charged with anything. When I look back, I think that from an activism standpoint, I've had sort of different phases in my life. As an anti-war and student activist, as a AIDS activist, as a union activist, as a gay activist. Around 1990, I got totally burned out. I resigned from the AIDS office, and
in Wikipedia, you listed the date 1996 as exhaustion. Is that what we're talking about?
No, we're not there yet. I left the AIDS office. Eventually, I was offered a job with an organization called We the People Living with AIDS, which was basically an organization of African American people and homeless people who had AIDS. And that appealed to me because when I was in the AIDS office, I was the decision maker. Now I was no longer the decision maker, and the city, to my view, the city was weakening its commitment to helping people with AIDS. So they had a drop-in center at Broad and Lombard, right across from what's now the Wilma Theater, I think, or the Suzanne Roberts Theater before it got gentrified. We had a drop-in center. Every month we would have about 800 people come through this drop-in center. They would get food, they would get clothing, they would get case management when they needed help managing their care. Of all of my jobs, it's the one I'm proudest of because I was very close to the people, the actual people I was helping. It wasn't like an intellectual thing. It wasn't our gay community.
Hands-on,
it was like
hands-on.
Darryl and Pete and Joe, people I knew. I stayed in that job for 5 years and remained as a gay activist. I like to think I was a more effective gay activist because I had run the AIDS office, and many of the programs that we were trying to get to be stronger were programs I had helped to start. So there was a lot of attention being paid to me as the former AIDS office director, who's now a community organizer around AIDS. But two things happened in 1995, 1996 area time. One was a new treatment for AIDS called protease inhibitors came onto the scene, and protease inhibitors promised to keep people alive, not necessarily healthy, but to keep them alive, even when they were sick. I mean, there's a whole lot of people who have AIDS who never even get sick, but the people who were the most likely to die from AIDS by that point in the history of the AIDS movement were poor people who didn't get good health care, homeless people, obviously. In Philadelphia, it was overwhelmingly people of color who were impacted by AIDS. And protease inhibitors came along. I had just finished a campaign to get homeless access to homeless shelters for people with AIDS, because they had been prohibited from going into any city homeless shelter, and there were no other alternatives for them. And so we fought that battle and eventually won that battle. And when protease inhibitors came along, I realized here I was fighting for homeless people with AIDS to get rental assistance vouchers, to get shelter beds. And there are people who don't have AIDS who can't get shelter or can't get into a program. And why should people with AIDS who are healthy get priority over people who were not healthy, who just didn't happen to have AIDS? And that was a real spiritual crisis for me. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but it felt like there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing, but is this really what I want to be doing? And the result of that was I decided I was going to leave We the People, which was the organization I had run for the previous 5 years. And I was so burned out that I eventually went into the hospital and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome after having...
Affecting from, by osmosis, what's the word? From the people that you were...
Yes.
The stress of the people that you were in contact
definitely.
with.
And I had been operating on all cylinders for quite a while by that point, probably 20 years. So I was just burned out, and and my roommate, he wasn't my partner, but he was my roommate for 15 years, died around that time. And so all of these things were ganging up on me. And so when I left We the People, I called up Estelle Richmond, a woman I had mentioned earlier as one of my mentors. She was the health commissioner at the time. I told her I was going to get out of doing AIDS activism. And she was like, oh, thank God. She was the health commissioner. And I was harassing her and aggravating her all the time. And but I said, if you have any ideas about what I can do for a living, let me know. And she said, well, I just got this federal grant to provide mental health services to children in South Philadelphia, because in South Philadelphia, 60% of the black students are diagnosed with a mental illness because there's no resource for them and nobody finding out why are they acting out. And she believed that there were things going on in the neighborhood and in the family that were traumatizing these kids, but they didn't necessarily need to be medicated, which is what the school district was doing to them, that there were better solutions for these kids. And she got this big federal grant to demonstrate an approach that she had, that she liked. She said, I don't like the way the guy who's managing that grant is doing the work, so I can give you a job managing this grant. It's a 50% pay increase over what I was making at We the People.
Very nice.
I was in the hospital at the time when she made this offer to me. I was on the payphone crying. I was so freaked out. I stayed in the hospital for a little bit, not very long, but
days or weeks?
Days, 7 days maybe. My only other stay in the hospital had been when I stopped drinking, which was in 1984, which is another whole story. But when I got out of the hospital, I went to Estelle. She gave me this job. I basically managed that grant for 6 months before I had the faintest idea what it was about. That's how my brain was fried. But eventually, when I realized what was going on and started to meet some of the kids and the families, and especially the grandmothers who were taking care of these kids, because there's so many grandmothers taking care of their grandchildren these days, much more than it used to be in the old days, it turned me on. It was like, I'm a bureaucrat in this system. Unlike when I was an AIDS activist in the AIDS office, this is a bureaucratic job. You're managing a federal program, federally funded program to provide mental health services to these kids and families. There was one component of the program, which was a specialist who would, when a kid acted out, the first thing or the second thing they would do after they talked to the kid was go visit the kid in the home to find out that was the whole idea behind Estelle's concept. Visit them in the home and find out what's going on. And if you can resolve what's going on in the home, or at least lessen the crisis, the kid's less likely to act out in school. And we actually succeeded in over a 5-year period. We actually succeeded in reducing the number of kids black kids who were being diagnosed with junk diseases like oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. These are things I had made a career out of, and now they were telling me it was a mental illness for these kids. We reduced that.
You made a career of being that way.
Yes.
Dysfunctional.
We reduced the number of kids on medication from 60% to 15% over that period of time.
Congratulations.
And
great work.
As a result of doing that work, I got to meet a whole new system that I had not been involved in before. There was a new mayor, there were new bureaucrats. People knew of me as the crazy AIDS activist, but they were seeing me in a different role. And in 1999, when John Street was running for mayor, I supported him along with only a couple of other openly gay activists, because he was perceived of as anti-gay, even though it was far from the truth. And we supported John Street. He got elected. He actually, he's a politician. He said, well, what do you want as a result of putting yourself on the line for me? And I said, Estelle was moving over to the managing director's office. I said, I want to work for Estelle. And so he put me in Estelle's office. It didn't take long for it to be clear that I wasn't politically stable enough as far as they were concerned to be representing the managing director, who was a pretty old-fashioned political person. Estelle worked for him. And a friend of mine had become commissioner at the Department of Human Services, and she called me up and said, I had told her I was unhappy in the managing director's office, and she said, I want to create a system that's solely based on keeping kids out of the DHS system. And I want you to come and run it. And so I said, absolutely. And we started off one Saturday afternoon when the city has to submit a proposal to the state every year for child welfare funding. And she said, I want to focus on kids who are chronically truant, because a lot of these kids end up in foster care, and they shouldn't be in foster care just because they're chronically truant. I mean, if something else is going on, that's one thing. But just being truant shouldn't have you taken from your family, even though that's what the law says. She says, I want to divert those kids from the truancy system. So she asked me to write a one-page argument for what we were calling truancy courts, where instead of a chronically truant youth being put into the foster care system and the foster care courts, they would be put in a separate community-based court that was not led by a judge, but was led by a master. And the point of the court was not to charge the kid and the family with failing, but to make sure the kids showed up somewhere where there would be professionals who say, what's going on in this family that's leading you to be truant? And what can we do to help so that not you, just the kid, your parents have a lot to do with this. How can we help the family so that your child will regularly go to school? And that eventually grew into a truancy court system that still exists today.
You setting this up, was this as a subdivision of City Hall and Philadelphia government, or it is?
Yes,
Okay.
as part of the Department of Human Services.
Okay.
The interesting thing was, I knew nothing about truancy except what Alba Martinez, who was the commissioner who brought me over there, was telling me. But she said, I want to ask for money for this plan, for these truancy courts. And I was known as a good bullshitter, so it's like I knew how to write grants really well. And I wrote this one-page description about something I really knew nothing about. We got $11 million.
Yeah, but you had good information to write it from, obviously.
And real data.
You didn't know about it, but you had good data and you knew how to write.
And so that was my first act as what the title was, Director of the Community-Based Prevention Services Division. And we grew that budget over the next couple of years to $96 million. And the advantage I had that nobody else had in government or in the community was that the money was unrestricted. I could use it for whatever I wanted to use it for. And we created a whole network of community-based prevention services, $35 million just for after-school programs. We had our truancy programs, we had our delinquency prevention programs, we had programs for parents who were in drug treatment, women especially who were in drug treatment, who were going to lose their kids because of their addiction. And we would help them while they were in treatment to understand how it is to raise a child when you're clean, which is different than when you're addicted. We had 100 different things going on, and that by far is my proudest achievement. And many of those programs disappeared when Michael Nutter became mayor because he hated John Street, and he closed a lot of the programs associated with him. But also, in his defense, the recession happened,
money draw,
and so he needed to cut somewhere, and it was easy to cut John Street stuff because he hated John Street. But some of those
Did we get it back?
We got some of it back, not very much of it, but we got the after-school programs back, which is in many ways the most important, because it's those 3 hours after school that most kids get into trouble. And if you have something for them to do, and the parent is working and can pick them up after at 6 o'clock or 5:30, those kids do better. The evidence is really clear on that. So that's what I did, and I did that for 5 years. Alba Martinez, who was the commissioner, eventually left to go work at United Way. She called me up one day and said, "I want you to come to work with me at United Way." And lo and behold, she was offering me 50% more than I was making at the Department of Human Services. I was more than a little still burned out. So the idea of going to United Way, which was like a whole different context than government, was appealing to me. I said this will be less stressful, which it really was.
So I have a question for you. You said at one point you were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress from the trauma that the people you were interacting with were facing. That's a serious diagnosis. Tell me about living with that and how, if you still have it.
Well, I don't know if I would still be diagnosed with PTSD, but I'm still on the medications they gave me.
To handle the effects.
Back in the late 90s, I'm still taking the same medication as I took then. So I don't know what would happen if I didn't take my medication, but I'm not taking any risks when it comes to that.
Because your condition was so serious?
Because I was suicidal. And
from the depression of dealing with the trauma of
it was
everything you described.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that I was thinking, I spent my life helping people who need help. It was that the people I was helping then were going through such stress, and my husband, my roommate, was dying from AIDS, and I was burned out, and I was controversial, and a lot of people didn't like me because I was pressing their buttons, and
to help these people.
To help these people, but if it felt very isolating, and I knew that I was thinking of ending it all. It was like I just can't take it anymore, and I wasn't in a relationship at the time. I think the doctors saved my life and gave me the right prescription. If they had given me the wrong prescription, I don't know what would have happened. But they gave me the right prescription, and I'll say that after leaving the Department of Human Services, where we were creating all these prevention services, after leaving that department and going to United Way, I mean no disrespect to United Way, but that was almost like being on vacation. I wasn't, in fact, working in the community in the same sense. Alba had hired me because she wanted to reform the way United Way gave out its money. And she knew I had a lot of relationships in the nonprofit community that were important. And we went through a process where we fundamentally changed how United Way invested what was then $50 million a year in the nonprofit community. I'm very proud of that. But that was that period of time was pretty much the only time, my only time as an adult, while I was not working directly with people who in some ways were very needy, and in some ways were helpless. You know, I had been doing that for a long time, and this was a break.
It sounds like a good one, though, too. One that you probably could have
I think
used.
I probably needed it.
Yeah.
I think it was, I do believe in God. I don't know how. I don't know how it works, how God works. But I don't know if he's a he, she, or an it. But I do believe in, I guess I believe in fate. And it felt, looking back, it feels like I needed that break.
So how long you were there, and what was the next step?
I was there for 5 years. I left mostly because I was bored, and and up until that point, I realized I had given millions of public dollars, and then on top of that, $50 million a year from the private sector. It was my job to invest that money in community organizations, and I did that. And as a result, I knew an enormous number of people in the nonprofit world. And so I thought, I don't like working that United Way anymore. It was really boring. I had gotten done what I was actually brought on to do. And I was beginning to have some tensions because I was really not putting my heart into it. So I left and decided to be a consultant, a nonprofit consultant. And I did that for 3 years. I hated it. I hated it with a passion because I was working by myself. I was mostly working with directors of nonprofit programs and the leadership staff of those programs, was helping them develop strategic plans that they would then put on the shelf and not use. And I wasn't making very much money. I was struggling financially.
So it was a private position, being a private consultant.
Yeah, but being a private, and there were 1,000 of us out there, nonprofit people who got out of whatever they were doing and were trying to make a living as a consultant. And I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself as a consultant. I'm used to doing things on instinct, and I didn't have the instinct to be a consultant. Also in 1996, I had met my partner, who's still with me today. We've been together for 26 years. When I was working as a consultant, I got to spend a lot more time with him. During that period of time, gay marriage was made legal, so we were able to get married, and that was like a whole different experience. But in 2013, I was hired as a consultant by the Department of Human Services, where I used to work, which was doing what they thought at the time would be a reform of the child welfare system, which basically was taking away from the city all of the direct care services for children in foster care and doing it through community organizations, nonprofits in the community who were closer to the neighborhoods where these kids were coming from. It was a very good idea. These agencies would be called community umbrella agencies because the city was supposed to start funneling money for prevention services and health care through these agencies to the particular neighborhoods they were working in, as rather than have government sitting up here saying, we have grants, apply for them. This money would be invested in neighborhoods. It was a really cool idea. Never had the chance, but it was a cool idea.
Never had the chance?
Never had the chance to succeed.
Oh, sorry.
For a variety of reasons. But I was charged with writing the request for proposals to identify these community organizations, which I did. And they put out a request for proposals and people applied and all that. But one of the organizations that wanted to apply for one of these community umbrella agency contracts was an organization called Turning Points for Children, which I knew of because I had funded them when I was at the Department of Human Services, and I knew the director well. And while I was a consultant, he wouldn't pay me to be a consultant, but he would take me out to breakfast once in a while so we could get free consultation on how to maneuver so he could get one of these contracts when they became available. And he called me up and he said, I'd like you to come and help us get these contracts. And I said, I can't do that because I wrote the RFP. But I said, I'll ask the Inspector General if they would allow me to do this. And the Inspector General said, as long as you don't write the tool for evaluating the proposals, everybody has the RFP. You don't have any special knowledge, so you can go work for these people. So I went to work for Turning Points for Children. That was the first time I took a pay cut to take a job. Took a 30% pay cut to work for them from what I was making as a consultant. But my job was to help bring more resources into what was a $4 million a year operation. These community umbrella agencies were $13, $14 million contracts. And so the director and I, mostly him, he decided, I'm going to apply, there's 10 regions. And he said, I'm going to apply for all 10 because maybe I'll get one. So we worked on the proposal. I didn't do most of the writing because I was still a little nervous about it being a conflict of interest. We had a grant writer do the proposals. But he wound up getting 2 of them out of the 10. And he said, I want you to manage these programs because you came out of DHS. And I said, yes, but my job was prevention. It wasn't providing services to kids in foster care and families in foster care. It was keep them out of that system. And he said, well, I have nobody else, so you're going to have to run these community umbrella agencies. Fortunately, he paid me more, so I was finally making a living wage. And we ran those programs for about 3 or 4 years when another agency, which was running community umbrella agencies, went bankrupt. And we picked up their community umbrella agency. So suddenly we had $45 million of city government money. We were a $4 million operation when I walked in the door. We had $45 million of programs and serving 3,000 children in foster care or getting what they call in-home services, where you're still involved in the court.
And you're administrating those
and
programs?
I'm responsible for managing these programs. In addition to that, we started a foster care program, which we had never had, hadn't had for decades. Turning Points today is a 188-year-old agency, so it's been around for a long time. And it used to do foster care, but foster care is different than case management for foster care. Foster care means that you're taking care of the kid in a family setting with a parent, foster parent. So it's a different program. But because we were serving 3,000 kids, we were able to refer to our own foster care program. And so we built what's now the largest foster care program in the region. So things were going along okay. Fortunately, my deal with Turning Points was that I was not going to stop doing other things I was doing. I served and still serve on a number of boards, some of which are doing work connected to my day job, most of which do not. I'm on the board of an organization that provides rental assistance basically to homeless people who are getting out of homelessness. I'm on the board of an organization that teaches kids in middle school about STEM, technology and engineering and math, those skills, because those are the kind of jobs that they need when they graduate from high school and college. So we're working with kids in the middle school age when it's easier to get them. I'm on the board of an African cultural organization in Southwest Philadelphia. I'm on a number of different boards because I don't have kids myself. I don't have a family to take care of. My partner is employed himself. He doesn't need me to make money for him. And
we sit on a Commonwealth Citizens Council related to the Symposium Organizing Committee with a campaign of greater father family involvement.
And I got involved in that back when I was at DHS because Bilal Qayyum, who runs the Father's Day Rally Committee, and Joel Austin, who runs Daddy University, came to me while I was at DHS and said, there's all these programs helping women in the foster care system, And the system is biased against fathers, and so as a result, a lot of fathers lose their connection to their children, or it's very difficult for them to be able to interact with their children in the child welfare system. And we need you, David, to put some money into our organizations so that we can advocate for these fathers. That's how I first got involved with father stuff.
What year was that?
That was 2003.
Oh, it was a long time ago.
Long time ago.
Oh, okay. So you stayed with it.
So we had a father, we created a new funding stream. We supported a few fathers organizations. There was an organization called the Comprehensive Center for Fathers, which did a lot of empowerment work for fathers, but also taught them skills to get jobs and things like that. The director of that was eventually arrested for mishandling the money, so the organization went away. But Father's Day Rally and at the university still exists. And years later, by the time I was at Turning Points, maybe 10 years later, Rufus, who I vaguely knew because he had run for state representative when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, called me up and said that he wanted to do something to help child welfare agencies respect fathers and help fathers. And he had gotten a Stoneleaf Fellowship to do this, or he was applying for a Stoneleaf Fellowship to do this. And he didn't really know his way around the child welfare system. So he asked me if I would help him, get what he needed to be able to, he knew what he wanted to do, but he needed to be able to write it up in a proposal to the Stoneleaf Foundation. He did that, and he got funded and created what's now called the 3FA network, which is a network of child welfare agencies that have developed father support programs of various types. And Turning Points was one of those. And so that got me more deeply involved with Rufus. And as a result, since anybody who gets deeply involved with Rufus never gets uninvolved. So since that time, I've been really I'm not a father, so it's like I can't articulate the mission of fathers organizations the way that people who actually are experiencing can. But I do believe that, like in the past, when I worked with communities I was not a member of, I can be helpful in terms of strategy, in terms of fundraising sometimes, in terms of communications, because one of the things I learned was how to get my name in the paper. So it's like I know how to write a press release, I know how to strategize around that kind of stuff, and Rufus has taken advantage of those capabilities.
And we sat on a committee with the campaign where you actually gave all the volunteers a script, not only to two things, I would say: talk on the phone when you called and reached out, and also an email, bullet points to send out. And you did that almost from scratch by yourself. We tweaked it, but you wrote it.
Yes. Well, the idea there was we were trying to get the legislature, the General Assembly, to establish the Joint Commission for Fathers, the Commission for Greater Father-Family Involvement, I think we were calling it. And we needed to get votes. And there was a concern, especially in the early days, that this would be perceived of as an anti-woman approach or anti-mother approach. Mothers are bad, fathers are good kind of thing, which was never the intention. So how we talked about this stuff became very important. And when we got Senator Williams to agree to push this legislation to create a commission to come up with a statewide plan around father involvement, Rufus came to me and said, well, you've been involved in advocacy to the legislature and to city council. How do we get our fathers who are involved in this effort, how do we get them to understand how to talk to their state representative or their state senator? How do we get them to think about the essential points we're trying to make, as opposed to just telling their stories? because anybody who's been in one of these fathers meetings knows you let somebody start telling their story and they're going to tell their story. And that's very important to be able to do that. But it's not what's going to convince a state representative to vote for this bill alone. You have to be able to make an argument for why this is something the state needs. And so what you're referring to was when Rufus asked me to develop some points for how to talk to your state representative, what an elevator speech is, and how to have a quick way of conveying what you're trying to accomplish. I don't know that we were ever very successful in getting many of the members of the coalition to use those.
I used it. I used your stuff.
But
before I reached out, I knew everything that we were supposed to do, but I didn't know how to word it, or I didn't know where to start. I went right to it every time.
Well, that's good to know.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you don't know what happens with the work that you do.
Oh, well, I use it. I can only speak for myself, of course. So, of everything that we've discussed, what do you feel most proud of, or what do you feel your biggest accomplishment was?
Of all of the things over the last 50 years?
Or top few, briefly, because you went through them in detail. But what was the hardest to do? What was the longest journey? What do you feel when you look back at what you've done? What are the top one or couple, if you need to say more than one?
Well, that's really hard to say because it's just hard to say. But I guess in terms of the different phases of my work, that the things I'm proudest of, there are basically two things I'm proudest of. One was Philadelphia was one of the first big cities in the country to pass a law that said you couldn't discriminate against gay people back in 1982. And I believe I played an essential role in making that happen.
I think you did too.
I mean, there's plenty of other people who deserve credit for that, and I was hardly the only one. But of all of the objectives I've ever had in my activism, that felt like the hardest one to achieve, but we actually achieved it. And we achieved it 41 years ago, long before it was happening. People were getting used to the fact that there were gay people in our midst. And I think in terms of my work, there were things I enjoyed more than when I was developing the child abuse prevention services system. But because I had control, basically unilateral control over $96 million a year, because I got to meet people in the neighborhoods who were struggling and were afraid of losing their kids to the system, and because I dedicated my whole being to creating that system, or leading in the creation of that system. I think that's probably my most important accomplishment. I mean, I could make the argument that I had an impact on AIDS that was outsized compared to other people, but there were 1,000 people fighting against AIDS, and it by far was the thing that got me the most attention when I was doing the AIDS work. But when you think about the entire system, we had an actual system that was dedicated to prevention of child abuse. I used to tell people I have the only good job in the child welfare system, and that's to keep kids out of the child welfare system. And we succeeded dramatically over those few years until it was the funding was taken away. And since I'm still doing work that impacts children, I think that that's the one that means the most to me.
Thank you for sharing that. David, something we discussed before we started is a post that I'd like you to comment on. I have a Facebook political discussion group where there was a meme that said, from a conservative poster, celebrating straight Pride Month with an American flag, patriotic symbols, under which I post, "You're missing the whole point." The response was, first I'm going to put it up on the screen and ask people to pause if they want to read the whole thing. But just to summarize it, what it said was, if gay is a way that you're born with, then why shouldn't every profession or every type of individual, ethnicity, and he gave a list, why shouldn't everyone get a Pride Month? And how would you respond to that? I have thoughts, but you have a more...
Well, I mean, I can respect that concern. I mean, I think that it betrays, however, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the LGBT community uses the term pride for. Apparently through the entire human history, having same-sex attraction and behavior was enough to kill you, to get you killed, or to certainly be ostracized. And the modern gay community knows that for the vast majority of us, we didn't have anything to do with choosing who we are. I don't know the answer to the question of whether people are born this way or whether environments create this kind of behavior. I have no idea I'm agnostic on where it comes from. What I know is that there are people like me who, from almost all of human history, when you go back to the Bible, have been ostracized and often penalized for loving people of the same sex.
And severely.
I'm sorry?
Severely.
And severely penalized, yes. In our memory, in my memory, people were being severe. I mean, there's Matthew Shepard, who was tied to a post and beaten to death in the Midwest, which was a big case back in the early days of the movement. What we're trying to say is that really, just like heterosexual people, we have the right to be proud of who we are. We're not saying don't be proud of being heterosexual, but we are saying we need to assert our pride because it's a corrective to thousands of years of telling us that we couldn't be who we were. So, I mean, I think pride is not about we're better than straight people. Pride is not about we have something to be proud of and you don't. Gay pride is about we're proud to be able to be who we are. And the typical heterosexual person doesn't have to assert that. But we do. There'll come a time when pride is an anachronism. Unfortunately, especially today, with the right wing and Trump and all the rest of it, we still need to assert ourselves as normal human beings who just have different sexual proclivities, and we have the right to be respected as who we are. And there's still an enormous number of Americans, and certainly in the rest of the world, who don't believe we have the right to be who we are. That's why we need pride.
David, thank you for that answer, and thank you for sharing your entire story. May it go on to inspire others the way it inspires me. Thank you for being a guest.
Thank you for the opportunity, Larry.